Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
We've got a really fascinating paper to dig into today. One that's, it's already stirring up some great conversations, and it's got us thinking deeply about some core assumptions in entrepreneurship research.
Yeah, it's definitely a thought-provoking one.
So this paper, it's titled, "We Are Experts on Elite Entrepreneurs, a Call to Integrate Marginalized Populations into Entrepreneurship Research." It's by Hwang and colleagues, published in 2024, and it's actually part of the Session 1 readings for the virtual summer school in entrepreneurship research coming up in 2025.
Oh, that's right. I'd forgotten it was on the reading list for this year.
Yeah, and this is going to be the 5th year of this summer school, which is a fantastic resource and completely free. It all started back in 2021.
It's amazing, honestly. The impact it's had in such a short time is incredible.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we'd be remiss if we didn't take a moment to express our huge thanks to Professor Vishal K. Gupta and PhD candidate Athena Skiadopoulou. They're both at the University of Alabama, and they've been the driving force behind this whole initiative, creating this unique and valuable program for the entrepreneurship research community. It's really something special.
Couldn't agree more. Their dedication is truly inspiring. It speaks volumes about their commitment to making cutting-edge research accessible to everyone. And like you said, this paper by Hwang and their co-authors, it's a perfect example of the kind of critical thinking this summer school is known for fostering.
Okay, so let's get right into it. The title itself, "We Are Experts on Elite Entrepreneurs." It's pretty bold, right?
Yeah, it grabs your attention for sure. It's a direct challenge, almost provocative, and I think that's a good thing. We need to be having these conversations.
So what is the core argument here? What was it that really jumped out at you when you first read it?
What really struck me was their main point. They're saying that when you look at all the research that gets published in the top entrepreneurship journals, it's overwhelmingly focused on a very specific kind of founder. They call them elite entrepreneurs.
So, the folks who come from privileged backgrounds.
Exactly. We're talking about people who are highly educated, often with degrees from those big name universities. They're usually financially well off and, statistically speaking, more likely to be male, white, and on the younger side.
Okay, so it's not just that these individuals are part of the research. The paper is saying this narrow focus has actually shaped our whole understanding of what entrepreneurship even is.
That's exactly it. Because so much of our research energy, our funding, everything has been directed towards this one demographic, our theories and models are primarily built around their experiences. And what the paper argues so well is that this creates this huge blind spot. We're missing a massive part of the picture when it comes to understanding who becomes an entrepreneur and what drives them.
And they're calling for a pretty big shift, aren't they? Who are they saying we should be studying?
The core of their argument is that we desperately need to start focusing on entrepreneurs from what they call marginalized populations. And they're very specific about what they mean by that.
So it's not just a general call for more diversity. They're defining these groups very deliberately.
Yes, absolutely. They define marginalized populations as individuals who are, they put it as being socially, economically, educationally, and politically distant from those elite entrepreneurs we've been talking about.
So they're really highlighting the power dynamics at play here.
Right, and they're also emphasizing that these individuals often face these really significant, often systemic barriers. We're talking about things like societal stigma, prejudice, discrimination, the lack of access to resources. And it's a diverse group. They're talking about people with disabilities, people with lower levels of formal education, immigrants, veterans, those who've been incarcerated, older adults, folks from minority, racial, and ethnic backgrounds, gender and sexual minorities. It's a very wide range of people who are often left out of the conversation.
And their reasoning for this shift, it goes beyond just fairness or representation. They're saying this is crucial for the very foundation of entrepreneurship research.
Yeah, it's not just about making things more inclusive, although that's obviously important. They're arguing that by overlooking these marginalized entrepreneurs, we're missing a huge chunk of the puzzle. In fact, they cite evidence showing that these populations actually account for a significant amount of entrepreneurial activity. But even beyond that, we're limiting the robustness and the generalizability of our theories. These entrepreneurs, they navigate a very different set of challenges, opportunities. They have different motivations compared to those from more elite backgrounds.
So you're saying our current understanding might be based on a very small, very specific and not very representative sample.
Exactly. And that means our understanding of entrepreneurship might only be telling a very specific part of a much larger story.
The paper brings up the relationship between entrepreneurship and employment as one area where this narrow focus has some really big implications. Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Sure. So a lot of existing entrepreneurship research looks at how prior employment experiences affect someone's decision to become an entrepreneur. You know, how their past jobs shape their entrepreneurial choices, how things like labor market conditions influence people to start businesses. Then we look at how those entrepreneurial experiences, in turn, affect future employment prospects. It's this whole cycle. But the paper argues that a lot of this research has been built on, well, it's been based on the experiences of those elite entrepreneurs. You know, the ones who typically have had more stable jobs, higher quality employment opportunities, and access to a lot more resources.
So someone coming from a background where their employment experiences have been very different, maybe they face more instability, fewer options, even discrimination. You're saying those underlying assumptions baked into those theories might not apply.
Exactly. And that raises a really big question. Do the same mechanisms and relationships that we've seen among elite entrepreneurs, do those hold true for people from marginalized populations, people who have had these very different employment realities? For example, our whole understanding of how prior employment provides valuable resources for starting a business, things like specific skills, knowledge, professional networks, that might look completely different for someone who's faced constant barriers in their career.
So it's not just a theoretical debate. This has real-world implications, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we think about entrepreneurship as a potential pathway to economic empowerment or better jobs for these marginalized groups.
Absolutely. There's a growing interest in exploring whether entrepreneurship can be a real viable solution to addressing labor market marginalization. But if our understanding of how that all works is based primarily on the experiences of people who haven't faced those same barriers, then all of our advice, our policies, the support systems we create, they might not be effective for the people who need them most. We might be missing the mark completely. And there's another point the paper makes. It's that our focus on elites might actually be leading us to, to valorize certain types of entrepreneurial ventures, like the high growth startups, the ones seeking venture capital, while potentially overlooking or even undervaluing other forms of entrepreneurship.
The kind that might be more prevalent in marginalized communities.
Yes, exactly. Things like necessity-driven businesses or those smaller community-focused enterprises that might be so crucial for those communities.
So it sounds like this paper is pushing us to not just think about who we study, but also how we even define entrepreneurship in the first place.
Absolutely. They really dig into this. The field often has a pretty narrow definition of what actually counts as entrepreneurship. It's often centered on incorporated businesses, the ones that have employees, or those operating in high-growth sectors. And what they show is that this inherently biases our research towards elite entrepreneurs.
Makes sense. Those are the kinds of businesses that are more likely to attract attention, get funding, be in the news.
Exactly. And they present a lot of evidence showing that, for example, women and racial minorities are disproportionately represented in businesses that are unincorporated or don't have employees. So by focusing so much on these formal high-growth models, our very definitions might be systematically excluding so much entrepreneurial activity that's happening under the radar.
And doesn't that bias also get amplified by our tendency to focus on specific industries, like all the attention on technology or finance?
Oh, absolutely. The paper highlights how a huge chunk of entrepreneurship research is concentrated on those knowledge-intensive industries. But the thing is, they actually represent a relatively small slice of the overall entrepreneurial landscape. And what's really interesting is that those sectors, they tend to be dominated by individuals from more privileged backgrounds. While businesses founded by women and racial minorities, they're often concentrated in sectors that get way less attention in top-tier management research, things like healthcare, social assistance, various service industries. So our industry focus unintentionally reinforces that focus on elite entrepreneurs.
It's like a self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah.
And even the way we think about how new businesses get funded, that plays a role too, right? The emphasis on venture capital, for instance.
Oh, for sure. Venture capital and angel investment, they're so high profile. But the reality is, they make up a tiny fraction of how most new businesses actually get funded. The vast majority of entrepreneurs, they rely on personal savings, loans from banks, or credit cards. But access to venture capital, well, that's heavily concentrated among elite entrepreneurs. Women and racial minorities receive a tiny percentage of total investment. So again, by focusing so much on these rarer forms of financing, we're building our theories on a very specific and not very representative subset of entrepreneurship.
So with all of that in mind, what are the theoretical implications of this persistent focus on employment and entrepreneurship among elites? Why does all of this matter for how we understand entrepreneurship as a whole?
Well, the paper makes a strong case that this bias has at least two major consequences. The first one is that by primarily studying elites, we're kind of making these implicit assumptions about what people have access to, what skills they already have, and even what kind of employment they had before becoming entrepreneurs.
So you're saying the assumptions that apply to elites don't necessarily hold true for everyone.
Right, and that's especially true for marginalized populations. They often face totally different realities in the labor market.
So our understanding of why someone chooses to start a business, it's shaped by the options that elites have, options that might not be available to many others.
Exactly. It's like we're looking at the world through a very specific lens. And the second consequence is that this focus on elites can kind of lead us to prioritize certain types of businesses and even judge what successful entrepreneurship looks like, high growth, lots of innovation and all of that.
A unicorn startup, the next big IPO.
Right, and that can mean we're neglecting or even undervaluing other forms of entrepreneurship, the kinds that might be the most viable path to economic stability for a lot of people, especially those from marginalized groups, even if they don't fit that traditional, high-impact venture-backed mold.
And that leads right into the next part of the paper, where they propose this whole research agenda. What are some of the big questions they suggest we should be asking?
Well, they're really smart about how they frame these questions. They basically take the existing research on employment and entrepreneurship, and then they look at it through this new lens, this focus on marginalized populations.
So they're not throwing out all the existing research.
No, not at all. They're just saying, okay, let's take these established ideas and see if they hold up when we consider the experiences of people who haven't been well represented in the research. For example, there's this idea of the jack-of-all-trades advantage. Entrepreneurs who have a wide range of skills often do better. And that's been observed a lot among elite entrepreneurs. But they're asking, does that hold true for marginalized individuals? Because for a lot of people, they might have had to develop a diverse skill set out of necessity.
Because they've had limited options, maybe had to jump between different jobs.
Exactly. And they might even be penalized for not having that highly specialized expertise.
So someone with a varied work history,
right?
If they come from a privileged background, they might be seen as adaptable, a go-getter. But someone from a marginalized background with the same history might be judged differently.
Exactly. And then they look at another concept, the small or young firm effect. The idea that working in a small company or a startup, it gives you valuable entrepreneurial skills, helps you build networks. But they're asking, are those benefits equally accessible to everyone, especially marginalized employees? Because even within those firms, they might face exclusion, or maybe they don't have the financial safety net to take the risk of starting their own business.
So even if you're working in a supposedly entrepreneurial environment, if you're facing barriers because of your background, you might not be getting the same advantages.
Exactly. And then they go on to talk about the high earner and performer effect. The idea that people who are really successful in their careers, they often have a harder time leaving to become entrepreneurs. But they raise this question. Do highly successful marginalized individuals perceive an even greater risk in leaving a secure job because they might face more bias in the entrepreneurial ecosystem? And if their business fails, they might have fewer good job options to fall back on.
So even if you're killing it in your career, if you're from a marginalized background, entrepreneurship might seem even riskier.
Exactly. And that's just a few examples of the kinds of questions they're raising.
Yeah.
They're really pushing us to go back and re-examine a lot of those foundational ideas.
And it's not just about tweaking existing theories. They're also calling for entirely new areas of research, right?
Yes, definitely. They advocate for more research specifically on the kinds of employment experiences that are more common among marginalized groups. Things like precarious work, the gig economy, part-time jobs. And they want to know how these different types of employment histories might shape someone's path to entrepreneurship. It's like, have we been so focused on traditional full-time employment that we've missed all these other ways people are developing the skills and resources they need to become entrepreneurs.
It's not just about the individual's experience. They're also looking at the bigger picture, the broader structures that affect things.
Yes, exactly. They say we need to pay more attention to how things like discrimination, limited opportunities for advancement, and all those credentialing requirements, how those things can actually drive people towards entrepreneurship.
Because they might feel like they have no other choice.
Exactly. But then they also say, okay, but even if you overcome those barriers and start a business, those same systemic issues might still affect your journey as an entrepreneur. They might affect your earnings, how long your business survives, your overall success. And that raises a really important question. Can entrepreneurship really help to level the playing field, or can it sometimes make those existing inequalities even worse?
And I think one of the most powerful parts of the paper is where they talk about the need to broaden our definition of success. What are the outcomes we're even looking at?
Oh, that's so important. They make this really strong argument for what they call a democratization of outcomes. And what they mean is that we need to look beyond just those economic measures of success, high growth, big financial returns. Because for a lot of marginalized entrepreneurs, there are all these other benefits that might be just as important or even more important. Things like dignity, self-esteem, being more engaged in their community, feeling more socially integrated. And they highlight how entrepreneurship in marginalized communities can create these amazing social benefits. Reducing recidivism, creating jobs for other people facing similar barriers.
It's a good reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all definition of success.
Exactly. But they also caution against, romanticizing entrepreneurship. They say it's important to also study the potential downsides and challenges that marginalized entrepreneurs might face. Things like increased social isolation or being more vulnerable in informal markets.
So it's not all sunshine and roses.
Right. It's about being honest and acknowledging the complexities.
Right. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Hwang et al.'s paper, what's the biggest takeaway for you? What's the core challenge they're putting out there for entrepreneurship research?
I think the most powerful message is that we absolutely have to broaden our perspective. We need to stop assuming that what we know about elite entrepreneurs automatically applies to everyone else.
And that's not just about being more inclusive, it's about the quality of our research, right?
Absolutely. The paper shows how this narrow focus has led to blind spots and limited the applicability of a lot of our existing theories. It's a call to action for all of us to really examine those assumptions we make about who entrepreneurs are and what their contexts are like. This is about developing theories that are more robust, more nuanced, and ultimately more useful for understanding the full range of entrepreneurial activity.
And those limitations of focusing just on elites, they're pretty significant, right?
Yeah, they are. When we rely on such narrow definitions of what entrepreneurship even is, we're probably missing a huge amount of entrepreneurial activity that's happening in these marginalized populations. And that means our current theories, especially the ones about the relationship between employment and entrepreneurship, they might not apply very well to those groups because their experiences in the labor market are just so different. And I think one of the most important points is that when we focus so much on traditional economic success, we're ignoring all those other valuable outcomes that entrepreneurship can generate, especially for people facing a lot of social and economic barriers.
They also offered some really interesting directions for future research. Just as a quick recap, what are the main areas they're pointing us towards?
They're really encouraging us to make systematic comparisons between the experiences of marginalized entrepreneurs and those from more privileged backgrounds. They want us to look at whether the same experiences might have different effects and to really explore aspects of both employment and entrepreneurship that we might have overlooked before because we've been so focused on elites. The goal is to get a much more complete and nuanced picture of how employment and entrepreneurship shape the lives of people from marginalized communities.
So for everyone listening out there, here's something to think about. If a lot of entrepreneurial activity is actually coming from these marginalized populations, how would our understanding of things like innovation, economic growth, and social mobility change if we put their experiences at the center of our research? What assumptions would we need to reevaluate? What would it mean to truly redefine what it means to be an entrepreneur and the role that entrepreneurship plays in our society? It's a lot to consider, and it's exciting to think about what the future of this research might look like. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.